Hey, everybody. Welcome to our webinar session on agrivoltaics for the solar siding rack. We've had lots of people ask lots of questions, express a lot of interest in the topic, and so we wanted to offer this for everyone today. If you could, type your name in the chat and what organization you're representing. That way we kind of got a record of that. And then we'll do some introductions. I'm Adam Tate, Renewable Energy Planner with DLCD. I've got John Jennings, also a DCD here with me, and Angie Brewer, and probably a few others before we finish up. And then I'll hand it over to Chad Higgins. He is with Oregon State University, and I'll let Chad introduce himself, and then Dave McFeeters Crone as well. They are agrivoltaic experts here today. So Chad, take it away.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, my name is Chad Higgins. I'm an associate professor here at Oregon State University in the Department of Biological and Ecological Engineering. If you want to get me more, let's have beers sometime. But we were limited in time today, so I'm going to just get right into it. But before I do, I just want to acknowledge that the work I'm presenting today is the conglomeration of stuff that I did, yes, but also all of my collaborators who are listed here, and folks that have helped throughout the many years that we've done this. So let's dive in. And, yeah. Just some level setting. It's not uncommon for growers to manage their resources on farm for maximum benefit to the crops. These are two examples that are really tried and true things that growers do. They have irrigation systems if they have a water resource to manage, and they usually have a tillage system or a no-till system or some other way to manage the soil resource and increase soil health. These things can be interrelated. There's a lot of soil health practices, such as increasing organic matter in the soil, such that it can retain more moisture and help you with your water resources. So it's something that's well-worn path that farmers manage their water and soil resource. But there's more or less three things that plants need: water, nutrients in the soil, but they also need light. And light is a farm resource that's often not managed. And the way I came to this as agrivoltaics in general was thinking about light as a farm resource that could be managed to help the farm benefit. And here's the thing about light. We have a fission reactor in the sky, and there is a lot of light or a lot of energy in sunlight. Just some unit conversions here. Over 5,000 horsepower per acre during the day. That's enough energy to put a ton of material in low Earth orbit in 17 minutes. So there's really an incredible amount of energy that's falling from the sky, from the sun, onto the land. The crops do a good job harvesting that energy and converting it into energy that we can use, calories. Sometimes that's converted into biofuels. And that process, solar harvesting, is what farming actually is. So in essence, what is agrivoltaics? Why does it work the way it does as light as a farm resource, and where can we put it? Because it's not a panacea, it's not an everywhere solution. So here's a sketch of what an agrivoltaic system is. If you think about the sun as a system, as a resource, this chat window. There's so much light in the sun, so much energy in the sun, that crops may or may not be able to use the entirety of it. So in the cases where they can't use the entirety of the energy available from the sun, shading those crops leads to benefits, including reduced water demand, which leaves more water available into the aquifer or soil. The light stress, once it's removed, it leads to more optimum growing conditions for the plants, and sometimes more growth, sometimes higher quality plants. And the fact that you have an active growing canopy under the solar panels, as opposed to, say, bare soil or gravel, it creates a microclimate for the solar panels that's more conducive for their production, meaning cooler, and there's more potential available energy produced because of that cooling climate. That is the hypothesis. And what I'm going to do, that's my assertion, I'll say. What I'm going to do first is to march through these benefits one by one and show you some evidence and some reasons behind why we think what this is, this works the way it works. All right, so reduces agricultural water demand. Let's look at this one in more detail. So plants evolved in a time long ago when there was actually more CO2 in the atmosphere than there is now. And through their growth over the eons, they reduced and used CO2 in the atmosphere till we got to the level we are today. What that means is that plants are limited in CO2, and the process by which they grab a CO2 and process it is governed by photons hitting the leaf. So if they can't get CO2 fast enough, given the amount of light that they're getting, that means, and that's the way it is, they're CO2 limited. That means that on the flip of that, there's more light hitting the leaf than the plants can use. This comes out in the so-called light saturation point of most plants, sometimes called the photonic limit, where you have, and I don't know if you can see my little pointer here, but you have more light means more growth, but only up to a point. And beyond that point, you have no more growth for more light. There's diminishing returns on light for plants. The ideal range for plants to grow is right here, right around the light saturation range. That means that they don't have to use any excess resources to cool themselves down because the extra light warms them up and heat stresses them out. Okay, so we have 30 to 50% more light in Oregon's summer than a typical crop can use. That is a solar excess that can be harvested and not detrimentally impact the growth of the plants, because the growth of the plants is not limited by the light, it's limited by the CO2 excess. Okay. That's the sort of basic fact that we need to understand before we can go on to the other things. The second basic fact we have to understand is I have to give you a primer on potential evapotranspiration, or PET, which is the amount of water that would evaporate from an open pan in a given environment. So you can imagine this, if I put a pan of water out in the Gobi Desert or somewhere very dry, Eastern Oregon, in a dry day, it would evaporate very fast out of that pan. If I did the same experiment in a cold, wet place, it would evaporate very slow. So it is the amount of water that can evaporate given the environmental conditions. And those environmental conditions include the sunlight, the wind, the air temperature, and the humidity. All things that you can imagine can either increase or decrease the amount of potential evaporation from that pan. So let's just go through it. More sun means more evaporation potential. More winds means more evaporation potential. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation potential. And the lower humidity means more evaporation potential. In the context of agrivoltaics, we are directly impacting the amount of sun that reaches the ground. So there is a direct change in the evaporation potential of that ground because we change the amount of light. So there's more than enough light for most crops. And if we remove that light, the downstream consequence is we change the evaporation potential. Okay. Those are the two things we have to take together. And what that means is that light and water cannot be disentangled. One more thing I want to say on this before we go, and I'm missing it because of this Zoom pilot is in the way here. If the evaporation potential is greater than the amount of precipitation that falls in that place, that climate is classified as water limited. So Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon is water limited. because the evaporation potential there is higher than the total precipitation that falls on that land. Okay, next one. So here you go. Putting this together, this is the plot that we saw before where we have light and we can take light away, and that moves us closer to the optimum light range for plants. But we can't do that without changing the evaporation potential. So locations that are good for agrivoltaics necessarily have to have a high ratio of evaporation potential to precipitation so that there's room to move it into the optimum condition. Okay, so that was a lot, and I'm going to explain this a little more deeply here. So remember on this slide back here, where if PET was greater than P, then it's water limited. So if PET is greater than P, then the ratio of those two, potential evaporation to precipitation, is greater than 1. That means it's water limited. Conversely, if that ratio is less than 1, that means there's not enough energy given the amount of water you have. It's energy limited. If you plot that up across all climates on Earth, which is this index here, you get a series of climates that are energy limited and a series of climates that are water limited. We have to be in a water limited environment if we're taking away light, because taking away light removes some of that water limitation, that energy excess, and pushes the water system towards optimum, which is this 1 point here. All right, so already us understanding how light and water can never be disentangled in an environmental system, it tells us something about the places where agrivoltaics are going to be most beneficial to crop growth. They're places where you have a aridity, which is, or a dryness index, greater than 1, because you can only reduce PET by shading. So if you're already at 1 and you shade it, you're going to put yourself over here and you're going to get less growth, right? So light and water can't be disentangled. The places where light and water move together so that both light and water move into the optimum condition is where agrivoltaics are going to be the most beneficial. If I can have you remember one thing about this talk, is that shading changes the water dynamics as well as the light dynamics. All right, just digging into this a little bit. Out east, how people deal with the fact that it's a water limited environment, meaning a dryness index is greater than 1, is they take you can't change the PET. Well, normal farms are not changing their PET. Standard practice is not changing their PET. So they add irrigation to the precip. If you add irrigation to the precip, you go from a drier situation more towards a water and energy are in balance situation. Okay. But we can also think about this as reducing the numerator here. By shading, we reduce the PET. So rather than thinking about this a water limited system, we can think about this as a solar excess system. And by shading it, we have the ability also to move us to a place where water and energy are in balance. And of course, we can do both of these together if we need more dimensionality in the system, and we understand how this works mathematically. Okay, so takeaways from this in the shade water equivalences: agrivoltaics are most likely to have the largest impact, positive impacts on agriculture in arid regions. And it's likely not to make sense where the aridity is less than 1, meaning energy limited systems. I understand mathematically how this works and wrote down the equation for this. So we can say, if you say, I can either irrigate to get to 1, or I can shade to get to 1, then the shade has a water value to it. So I can say water equals shade, which is this Fs, times the climatic variables of the system. Here's humidity and water, here's radiation, here's solar panels' influence on radiation, and here's the thermal impact of solar panels on the environment around them. Taking that all together, I can do calculations like the following. Klamath is a water limited place, meaning it's an energy excess place. If I put an agrivoltaic system there with a 40% shade level, that would be the equivalent of irrigating that same land by 5.5 inches of water extra per year. So these things actually matter quite a bit when you're in a situation where, for farmers, they're getting curtailments on water, their water availability is less. It's waterless irrigation. You can think about agrivoltaics in that way. Shade can be thought of as waterless irrigation, and here's the equation for it. So we just finished more water available. Let's do more food. I'm not going to put a lot on this. We've done several trials on it. Why is this not showing up? Well, I don't know why my figures aren't showing up, but imagine that there's a plot there, and I'll make sure this shows up, John, in the actual, wait, if I do this way, why is this broken? Interesting. Okay. You're gonna have to trust, well, there. If I go over here, I don't know why it's working. Oh, it wasn't. God damn it. Sorry to swear, folks.
That's okay, bud. Hang in there.
All right, whatever. Just know that we've demonstrated that yes, more water remains longer under the solar panels, which is the plot there, and yes, we experience more growth because of that. So we have larger plants. Oh man, you guys are killing me here. What's happening? All these just worked. Nobody cares about the equation. Hold on.
What about closing that format background box on the right?
Yeah, why don't we do that? I was just pulling this off.
It shows up on the one you sent to us via email earlier, Chad, if you want to switch
Yeah,
over.
it was showing up on that one too. I can just stop and
I can share that one and you can just tell me when to change slides if you like.
no, let's do this. I am going to go back to this and we'll see if this works. I mean, they're showing up here. Let's try this. Let's try this, folks. Nothing like a good old technical difficulty to really increase your
We've all been
confidence
there.
in my ability to do science.
It's a Friday.
It is a Friday. You've seen these slides now. There's so in terms of less stress plants, more food, better food, less stress because they have more water. So here we see that in the shaded zone, which is the blue ones, we have water available for the whole growing season because of this effect that we just described. Whereas in the control area, which is this green one, we have water going below the level where crops can grow well. And because of that, we had a longer growing season in our shaded zone and got a much higher dry biomass production. This is sheep pasture forage mix than in all the other areas. This is emblematic of many other studies that have been done, not only by me, but by my collaborators around the world. They've shown positive agricultural benefits by shade in areas that are arid. And if you look in the literature, folks like in certain areas of provincial France have much less benefits than, say, folks in Arizona, because the benefits go with dryness of the surrounding ecosystem. All right, so that was that one. And now we have cooler panels produce more energy. In this instance, here's the equation. What matters is as the temperature of the panel goes, you get a reduction. There's a minus sign right there. temperature of the panel. As that goes, reduction, minus sign, and the efficiency of the panels. The rate at that, the key thing in this equation is this EREF, this reference efficiency. Here's a shit ton of references on that. It goes somewhere around 0.05 according to all of these literature values. So you get a reduction in panel production the hotter the panels become. They're like any other electronics device. My phone overheats if I leave it in the sun. Solar panels overheat. They can actually overheat and stop performing at their peak level. We can do an energy exchange on this. That's the equation. No, I'm not expecting you to care, except for the real math geeks in here. That's for you. And we can run this equation with our actual measurements of the solar array and show that, yes, there is a reduction in efficiency as the air temperature increases, as the wind speed changes, and as the humidity, there's not much of an effect. So, so the climactic conditions, the air temperature and the wind speed that the solar panels change favorably also favorably change the environmental conditions around the solar panels to help them produce more energy. And when we did a global analysis of this, ranking different land use types, their solar power potential because of the ecosystem function that they provided and the available solar resource, croplands came out as the #1 place to put solar as a land use class. So agriculture provides ecosystem service benefits to solar panels in meaningful ways. That's that one. So now we've gone through the major benefits for the agrivoltaic system. Let's say it one more time. The shade, reducing the shade strategically in places where you have extra sun, changes the water dynamics and leaves more water available in the soil for crops to grow. Reducing extra sun means you're reducing the stress of the plants and they're growing more efficiently. The growth of the plants provides ecosystem services to the panels themselves, and they can produce more energy in those situations. Okay. All of this is expressed in equations, so it's totally possible to just as heavy lifting in that sentence there, to do a lot of work and put this into GIS systems to look at places where agrivoltaics may or may not have the most benefits from various perspectives. Here's a water perspective one. This is taking into account the native precipitation of those places. So if this is all true, and I've provided sufficient evidence enough for you to see and believe that is true, we can harvest these benefits situationally. What is then possible from a national and global perspective if we start to think about these systems? Well, this is work by Kyle Proctor, looking at large-scale adoption of dual use or agrivoltaics in the nation, and he found that 1% of farmland achieves the sustainable energy targets. It would cost $1.2 trillion for the government to pay everything, assuming no profitability, although the payback on that would occur. That would create 20 million jobs, and most of the Green New Deal goals would be addressed from an agrivoltaics adoption on 1% of farmland. So it's not a everywhere solution, and it doesn't need to be an everywhere solution, because a small fraction of adoption on farmland leads to some pretty big benefits in national food security, energy security, and water security. Here's a cute little analysis that we do. This is Casey Stedman's work, where she looked at every single intersection in Oregon and then put a circle around it to see if there was enough suitable land for agrivoltaics around that intersection to power every car in the situation that in 2050 every car was electric. And turns out, and we were very restrictive on our criteria here. It had to be ag land, it had to be a class 3 or higher soil, had to be not north facing, it had to be flat, had to be a certain distance to the highway. It had to not be a forest site, not an indigenous site, not a wetland, all that kind of stuff. And even with all those restrictions, consistent with the soil classification rulings of the DLCD at the time, 84% of intersections in Oregon had sufficient agrivoltaics land around them to power all the traffic if that was wanted to be done. So there's, again, we're back to there's an awful lot of energy in the sun, so it doesn't take a huge acre footprint to make big things happen on the energy side. Moving forward into farming, I think there's a lot of opportunities to take the energy that you're making on farm and also plow it back metaphorically into the farm, both with electrifying farm equipment, which is what this little guy is supposed to be showing you here, is bopping along, and in terms of nitrogen fertilizer production. Here's an example, Nitricity, of a startup company that takes water, air, and electricity and turns it into fertilizer on farm. And if you're generating the electricity on the farm, you can generate all of your fertilizer on farm. So there's a lot of ways we can take the agrivoltaic infrastructure and extend it to help farms. I'm not going to get in that today because you don't want me to geek out on farm sustainability in the future. We're talking about least conflict solar here. Last thing, in terms of global sustainability, we can take what we know in equations and look at scenarios of future actions. This plot is why I'm not worried about our future. And I'm probably one of the few scientists that would say that. We looked at 20 million future scenarios in terms of climate variabilities, whether we solve climate change or don't, whether we change our diets or don't, how we make our food, how we grow our food and consume our food, whether we reduce food waste, all of the sort of things that people worry about. And it's kind of a complicated plot, but basically blue is all of the actions that could happen under those assumptions. Red is we don't have the technology and we'll never reach that level. And green is if the blue crosses the green, then we're in a sustainable globe moving forward. And of course, time is down there marching forward. But what had the biggest impact? And we could construct scenarios where we are fully sustainable in food, energy, and water before 2050. They all had agrivoltaics in them. And here's an example of agrivoltaics plus alternative calories. All the blue crosses into the green before 2050. Alternative calories here is things like, introducing a little more seaweed into the food system, lab cultured meat, that kind of thing. It uses less water. Agrivoltaics alone couldn't do it. No solution alone could do it. I mean, climate action B is an example of if we snapped our fingers today and solve climate change, it does better than our current course, but it doesn't get us to sustainability. All right. So, but all of the sustainable paths that we found out of the 20 million scenarios had agrivoltaics in it. And by the way, agrivoltaics is a profit positive way where the incentives of private industry are aligned with climate and sustainability goals, but they're not required to be. They're selfish motivations that align with those sustainability goals. So this is why I'm not worried as a scientist about our future. I think we're currently on a path that can lead us to a more sustainable future. Okay, so we've gotten to the point of hopefully understanding that on the local scale, we have benefits that can be harvested on the farm, both from reduced water use and water demands, possibly more growth, possibly more energy from that system, as long as we design it right and put it in the right place. So, and that's kind of hard to say, as long as we design it right. So how do we design these systems so that we can actually get these benefits and allow growers to still access the land below them? Well, here's an example of one such system. I'm not going to comment about whether I think this is a good example or not, but here is something that's, yes, it's fully possible, and there's a harvester driving through a solar panel system. I will say, excuse me, that I did the economics on this particular system for Oregon, and it doesn't pencil out. This is a system that's in Europe right now. They have a much different incentive regime and benefits regime for their solar. So you get other designs like that. But it's technically possible to design a system. And it's actually quite easy to imagine systems where you can get farm equipment through. The challenge comes in designing systems you get farm equipment through that are also profitable in the United States, given our current incentive structures and energy prices and steel prices. Here's the variety of ideas and how to do it. There's interwoven, where you farm between the rows. There's dispersed, where you have sort of large dual axis trackers around, and there's elevated, where you go above the crops themselves and have all your equipment go under. Let's do some economics games, shall we? What we learned in the prior work was that shade changed water availability or water demand. So if you're in an irrigated system, so here's a crop yield simulation. Panel height is on the x-axis, distance from panel is on the y-axis. So basically the y-axis means less and less shade, and panel height means more and more dispersed shade as we go up. What you see in an irrigated system is we don't really see a lot of yield benefits. In fact, our yield is basically almost 1. We're getting our economic benefits from water savings, and we're getting a similar yield because, remember, that irrigation took us to optimum growing conditions already. So now we use less irrigation to get us to optimum growing conditions, but we're at optimum growing conditions. So we're, 80, 90, 95, 98% of what we were growing before. In a dryland situation, you have the water that's available to you naturally that's limiting the growth. Now you're pushing the system closer to optimum. So you have tremendous increases in yield, up to 2.5 times more yield here in these conditions, in this sort of Goldilocks shade zone. So with the same water. So irrigated, you have water savings, but similar yield. Dryland, you have same water, but more yield. Combining what we know about the light, shade, water relationships in crops and the price of racking systems, which this is racking systems quotes we got from just asking for quotes around, you see that there's this big delta once you go above about 7 feet in height. Excuse me. And what that does, this is when you get to sort of shed systems and very high systems. There is just a big step change there. We couldn't find a gradual one in between. So combining these, we can make economic predictions on what is viable and what is not, given the current racking designs out there. And as soon as things get above 50 cents per watt installed for racking, the profitability goes out the window, is what that is. Here is that scenario. What that means is those tall ones here, anything sort of above a meter, 50 cents a watt is kind of here. Anything above that puts it out of profitability under the currently quotable racking designs that we could find. So what that means is, when we built a demonstration in collaboration with OCPC, the Oregon Clean Power Cooperative, we went with single axis trackers, not elevated, in an inter-row configuration. This penciled out for our solar funders, OCPC and collaborators. And it led us to work on and come up with a set of basic design guidance if you wanted to do agrivoltaics of a system like this, and how to maximize land access with a system like this. They are maximum rotation. These are in cathedral mode right now for land access. We were just tilling in this picture. The max angle on these is about 55 degrees. There are systems available now that weren't available then that go up to 78 degrees, and they're usually marketed as hail protection systems right now. I expect there'll also be some marketing around agrivoltaics for those as well, because the more rotation you get, the easier it is for you to access your land. Um, we've seen that bifacial panels are more beneficial in an agrivoltaic setting than monofacial panels. I know bifacials are more or less standard these days for solar, but they're a little more translucent. They're translucent, not fully opaque. They let some light through. They also capture some of the reflection off from the growth of the plants. Um, this land is pretty flat, but you can actually see that this system is terrain following. I think that's important as we move forward, because that means there's less disturbance to the soil on installation. We want to keep the soil disturbance to a minimum, because if that's currently farmland, there's probably been some effort to build the soil health up to a certain level to support crops. And by laser leveling or otherwise mucking about in the field, that might be disturbed. Notice these are not gang drive systems, they're center drive systems. A gang drive system is going to just put that shaft through the center there and make it impassable for our tractors. Center drive is the way to go. We definitely put our wires in trenches deeper than code. That's because here on this site, there's a soil ripper that's 3 feet deep. So everything went 4 feet deep that's underground. Finally, notice the tremendous amount of room at the end of the rows before any fencing occurs. This is so that we can make our tractors turn around at the end of the rows. If there's one thing to do to make things agrivoltaicsable, if that's even a word, is the fence setbacks. No sane farmer wants to back his or her tractor up through a row to go to the next row. You want to make sure that there's enough room between the end of the row and the fence for the standard equipment for that site to turn around and go down another row. You know, turn radii matter for the farm equipment. All right. On the install, you want to use smaller equipment. You want to minimally disturb the soil. You know, access roads, if you can, keep them to a minimum. I know fire access roads are important on large installs and have to be considered, but the more land that's graveled for roads is the more land that's taken out of production of farming. I prefer using smaller equipment. Here's our system going in this picture here. It's just a little skid steer with the post pounder. This caused virtually no soil compaction, and we could do all of our farming immediately after that went in. That was no problem. But if you're taking in a giant, you know, whatever D8 something, I'm trying to think of my dad's favorite giant backhoe. I can't right now. But if you're taking in giant equipment, you're going to cause some soil compaction, and that might cause issues down the line for the farming. And if there is any soil prep you need to do for the farming beforehand, say for cover cropping or other restoration effects that you want downstream of installation, post installation, you're going to want to start that soil prep ahead of time and work with a consultant on your seed mix for that beforehand. All right. And lastly, you know, I've seen some projects get a lot of backlash from communities. It's really important that we communicate with communities ahead of the time. I tell solar developers all the time this quote: you have to be of the community, not above the community. And that's hard to do. And you know, you get in, you be part of the community by like participating in it, talking to people. Preserve the agricultural land for future generations. Talk to the community about that. Make sure people know that this is preserving agricultural land. It's not removing agricultural land. And you have to work with the current land managers from the beginning. They're the ones that are going to tell you about their farming practices, how you work with those farmers, and how they're going to adapt their farming practices, and how solar developers may have to adapt their solar designs to accommodate agricultural equipment of the current practice. And that's the negotiation that has to happen to make it agrivoltaics to begin with. So I don't have enough time to go through all the research that we've done. I'm going to just do a quick rundown in the next few slides. All of it's on the website. It's right there. If you want to check it out, hop on the bus and go on down to the website. in terms of high value stuff of what high level thoughts about what the research we've done over the past 8 years or so, that 1% of ag land can produce all the raw power needed for us. You know, with if somebody figures out the storage thing, with that caveat, I should put a little star on that. Distributed nature of agrivoltaics can be leveraged for electric vehicle charging at a lot of intersections. We can take excess peaking energy and repurpose it for further sustainable practices on farms. With plants, we see yield and nutrition increases in plants, and water use efficiency is increased by as much as 3 times. We've studied insects and pollinators. We've shown that blooms increase in partial shade zones and bloom timing is delayed in the shade. What that does is it creates a longer foraging window for insects and helps them maintain their hives over the winter. In terms of grazers, in particular sheep, we've shown that the increased productivity of the land translates into the increased productivity of sheep, meaning more head per acre. Shade zones are just good for sheep. They love the shade. They preferably hang out in the shade. They are less hot. They drink less water. They have less stress, and they're generally happy. Where are we all going with this? There's still a lot to do. I mean, I showed you some of our preliminary models, results from economically modeling the agricultural production and the solar production and the racking. We still need to work on that. We need to work on the optimization of the system. I get questions all the time that are like, hey, here's my pin. What crop should I grow? And what's the right shading percentage? Those are actually pretty hard questions, and I can give them general guidance right now, but I can't give them the optimal solution right now because we're still working on, making it even better, our engineering designs. Perceptions and risks are ongoing. We've done that economic modeling, and here we are in laws. And the science has changed pretty rapidly over the past decade in this. And I'm really happy that there's a discussion on what this all means and how this can fit into a land use paradigm that's beneficial for Oregon and Oregon farmers. So takeaways: most crops get too much sun in North American summers. We can take that away and reduce their stress. You can't change the light without changing the water demands. If you take away light, you'll reduce the plant water demands. Agrivoltaics in general are a key pathway towards food, water, and energy sustainability. And in terms of what's available on the market right now, interwoven is more likely to pencil out from a solar developer's perspective than elevated ones, but advances are ongoing. And this is the nod to you, Dave, who's going to be talking next. I think there's a lot of exciting years ahead for our research. We're getting into things about controlling the light moment to moment, thinking about frost protection, changing water demand on demand, increasing revenue streams, all kinds of things, and lots of work to do. I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully I didn't go over time.
Oh, you're good. Thank you so much, Chad. I know people probably have lots of questions, but we're going to pass it over to Dave real quick to talk about a unique agrivoltaic system he is working on. It's all yours, Dave.
Thank you. I'm going to take over the screen if that's all right.
Go for it.
Okay, and I'm going to actually go through a couple of different things, not just mine, if that's all right as well, just to give people an idea. Just forgot this working.
Yeah, that's great.
Oh, I got to stop sharing. There you go.
All right, is my screen visible?
Yeah.
All right, so this is the REMTech model that Chad showed earlier. And these first ones I'm going to show I will describe as like the sort of Ferraris of engineering. And they're complicated, they're expensive, and they use a lot of steel. Chad's probably done more techno-economic analysis than I have, but this one it's an interesting model, but like I don't think it's actually practical in all situations. Like he was saying, it has some of the cable stayed supports, which you'll see in a number of items, including the one I've developed. And but in this case, this is a dual axis one, but it's got a lot of moving parts, and I don't have any way of knowing how long this would work from a mechanical perspective, but it's nifty. I mean, I can't deny that. And as I said, it's Italian, and like as cool as I am, I'm never gonna achieve this sort of level of Italian coolness. I'm surprised he's not smoking at that exact moment. This is the cathedral method that Chad was mentioned before. This is located on the I think the AgriSolar website or TSE's website. This is another I call this cable. It's sort of a hybrid cable spanned, excuse me, where you do have your large poles. They are set in concrete, and they have this interesting tension cable method, and then sort of checkerboard HSATs, horizontal single axis trackers, being suspended between them. It's very interesting. And this, I should note that I can't tell when these pictures are real and when they're photoshopped. Pretty sure this one's photoshopped. Again, TSC I think is also Italian. If it's not Italian, it's likely French. Many of you are familiar with the root sun tracker method. So this is what I would describe as a pole-mounted vertical single axis. So these will twist, not pictured, and this is from their website. Not pictured here are a series of pitch poles that are on the edge that end up holding this array upward. And the goal with this is to use as minimal extra steel as possible. So these poles are relatively slight, strong enough to withstand a cow rubbing on it, and it sits on a relatively shallow foundation. All of that means less steel and potentially will push that the cost back towards the left side from that chart that Chad had showed. As Adam mentioned, I've been working on a modified version of this. This is just a rendering, obviously. And this doesn't use any proprietary tracking. It uses a standard horizontal single axis tracker on top. And what we're doing here is limiting the cost and size of these poles, making them thinner, and then using cable stays to hold them down. Now, the limitation is that you have cables going all the way across, and you need to have those be high enough. In my opinion, because of all the questions regarding how does the crops grow, I'm hoping to see this, and also I think Root's methodology also is to go over rangeland. And not that grass isn't important to grow appropriately, but I feel like the downside risk of that is easier to manage than it is over high value crop of any sort. A couple others, including one that I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with. This is another group called this is Sun Agri, excuse me. Again, this is sort of a reinforced high steel sitting in concrete pads method. And I mean, the thing is they've deployed these in Europe and they've been successful. But again, the rebate structure is much different. In fact, in Germany, I was told that you can't install solar unless it's got a dual use. So those incentives are there both on the monetary side to making it easier to do, but also regulatory. We didn't talk at all about the vertical panels, which I think are really interesting. The economics of this, in my opinion, are still out. And I don't know how these survive strong winds because they're just, facing difficulties. However, installation is really easy. Anyway, again, I can't analyze this yet, but this is a continuing evolving area, which I think is really just fascinating. This is the new one, and this is actually the business development guy for this is in here in Oregon. I've talked to him a couple times. It's hard to get a good feel for this, but these are actually cylindrical tubes with a solar panel that's inside it, so they're really thin. It's a whole new form factor. But the advantage of this is it's really easy to put up. It's incredibly wind efficient, and it benefits from all the standard sort of cable staying that you might want to do, but the span distance is dramatic. I've put together a set of URLs for all of these things that I just showed, and I'll be sure and get that to Adam so he can take a peek at it. So netting all these together, I'm going to stop sharing if I can. Netting all these things together, there's a lot of work that's going on in this space, and it's really exciting. The work that Chad's doing right now is like he's going after his own sort of set of low-hanging fruit. My version of low-hanging fruit is sort of, I guess, low-hanging beef. And I think that there's some really nice opportunities in that space. I think I'd like to just sort of pause there and just see if there are questions for Chad or I without taking all the less time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much, Chad. We got about 10 minutes left. Anybody's got questions, feel free to fire away. All right, looks like we got Mike raising his hand. What you got, Mike?
Hey, I was wondering, Dave, particularly on the vertical bifacial panels, have you taken a look at screw mounts as opposed to pounding? They might have more options for different soil types and easier removal and decommissioning. I'm not sure about the cost, but I just wondered if you've looked at any of those kind of screw mount systems that go with those vertical panels.
Yeah, so the screw mount systems would actually work really well for Roots, mine, which I call Minerva, as well as those vertical ones. Because you don't need the same strength of the foundations because you have all the cables staying. And I'm not a structural engineer, so I can't answer that question specifically. I think there's something to that. And the other thing that I see is that, there's a big difference between doing something at utility scale, community scale, and what I would say just small, right? And it becomes challenging when you get smaller. You lose a decent number of economies of scale. If I was going to wave my magic wand, I think there's a great opportunity for distributed energy generation for irrigation pumps in arid lands, and being able to stack them up in a way that you, instead of just relying on getting a 10 or 50 megawatt system in place, you could, this is magic, but if you could just stack up a series of 500 kilowatt systems, down a stretch of land where irrigation is necessary, you might be able to return some of those economies of scale. But those things still get sucked into, some of the fixed costs that are just really expensive, namely, connecting to the grid. And that's where smaller distributed energy that's being consumed locally could be the magic that allows those things to happen. And in some of those cases, I'll say, for the record, you may not necessarily need dual use. Maybe you just need to stick it, it's just distributed, in what I call the pivot corners, where it's kind of fallow. And then you're powering locally and everyone's sort of happy. I mean, it would be nice if they were raised up so you could use that in some other way, because now that fallow land is fallow because it's not well irrigated, but now it's got less sun. And so maybe that changes the dynamic and you could put some interesting crop in there, or, you make it a pollinator habitat in some way. All right, so to answer your question, yeah, I think helical anchors are a great idea.
Steve.
Hey, good. Oh, Stevie. Oh, you know what? I think, hang on a sec.
Well, it doesn't show that you're muted, Steve, but we can't hear you.
Probably a button somewhere.
If you want to type it in the chat, Steve, we can do it that way too.
Dugan, you want to try while Steve is
Yeah. Yeah, while we wait for that. And sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Dugan here with Pine Gate, and love these presentations, and I think I mentioned this on earlier calls, but Pine Gate has a couple operating smaller scale projects in the valley that either use sheep on site or have pollinator habitat with bees just outside the fence line. But I think we've looked into this in many ways, and I'm kind of thinking about in the Eastern Oregon context, it's certainly a different thing. And I appreciate Chad, you mentioning kind of, the difference there. A lot of the development is happening up in the northern part of the state, northeastern part of the state, where there's a dryland wheat farming, thinking about the difficulties up there, because sure, you could maybe on a dryland wheat farm get more forage underneath, but the inner rows, you know, it looked like on your graph that would be even less like production in terms of, I guess you were looking at forage there, but just knowing how little rainwater gets up there, and I mean most of it is dryland. I'm just trying to think of the application up there on dryland wheat farms. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that specific application, given, you know, there's a lot of transmission up there. So maybe that, you know, that's where I'm seeing a lot of the larger energy solar projects go specifically.
Yeah, I think if you were going to try to do dryland wheat, you'd have to change the agronomics substantially to work with agrivoltaics. I mean, if you just start at the beginning, they harvest that with a 54-foot header on a combine that's 15 feet tall. So either you have to be 16 feet tall or 54 feet between the rows. And both of those kind of push economics of solar out a little bit, sometimes a lot. So it would really be with, and here's one of the really interesting opportunities for agrivoltaics. That dryland wheat is 2 on, 1 off, meaning they actually take a fallow year to let the water accumulate so they can do dryland. If you do an agrivoltaic system there, the water dynamics could be such that you could grow something other than wheat that's more beneficial to the grower. Because of that water, sort of that waterless irrigation aspect that we talked about. So if you're gonna do something in, let's say, near 97, northern part of the state, I would really look to a farm plan that explored other crops that use smaller equipment and that are higher value for those farmers, is what I would recommend. I see Steve's came through. Has there been any thought about bifacials that are spaced like snow fences to harvest snow in the winter for summer irrigation? I haven't thought about it from a snow context because we don't really get a lot of snow out here, and I should, but we do have a couple projects right now where we're harvesting rainwater from them in the winter and thinking of ways to store it for summer. You get a lot of volume on the wet side here, so looking at how you store that big a volume is the big question there. But yeah, people are thinking about that from a harvest precipitation with the panels. You can use that from that. Dave, you got anything on that? All right, Jack, you got your hand up.
Good afternoon. The other day I was visiting with David's son Guy, and he coined a term I hadn't heard before called solar savanna. And one of the slides you showed was dispersed. And for example, in the background behind me, wouldn't it be neat if we could have solar panels dispersed across a rangeland so that we wouldn't have this concentration of nutrients that cattle could better utilize, better spread the nutrients?
I think that's great. That's the ones in that picture are from the dispersed ones are from S-Trackers or Strackers down out of Roseburg. And Dave's system is kind of like that. Dave, you want to talk about cattle? I'm sure.
Yeah, I you know, that goes back to like, how are you going to deploy this? And, you know, are you going to get the interest of a large utility scale developer to do something like that? And I'm going to say categorically, no. I mean, they have one way of doing things, and that's to just put as many in a smaller area as possible. So you're going to need something, you're going to need a community solar style developer, someone who's willing to be more creative and understand how that works. And there are some economics that work against that too, right? You've got stuff that's dispersed and it becomes problematic. But I think that's a great idea. I mean, you know, the number that I hadn't seen before from Chad's presentation is how much extra water you would actually get in Klamath if you were to shade a significant amount of it. I mean, 5.5 inches sounds like a lot of water. And the other thing I'd point out is, like, even if you've got an area where there's enough water, putting water back into the system still a global good. So there's no end of the goodness that agrivoltaics can do. However, all the numbers have to match up, and that's tricky. And I'm sure many of you know, like, one of the secrets, like, you know, is that is to find the right grant structures to make that work. And
Yeah.
you know, if you look at a small enough array and you get a REAP grant, and that's about half of your costs, then you know, if you look at back at Chad's picture, if it goes from, if your costs are going from, you know, 1 cent a watt to 2 cents a watt, but half of it's paid for, that's, you're back down at 1 cent a watt. So that's in my business model. But yeah, that's it for that.
I'll say two more things about that. I do think cattle is one of the big frontiers in agrivoltaics, and the reason why I think that, particularly rangeland, is because that 1% of farmland is not including rangeland, and the rangeland far exceeds even that area. So you know, there's a huge amount of space in rangeland, and I think of grazers as autonomous harvesters of my farm product, which is grass. So it's like the technological farm of the future that people dream of, with the little Roombas around the field doing the thing. It already exists. It's called rangeland. The second thing that you talked about was nutrient distribution. We've done some really interesting measurements I didn't include in here because they're a little preliminary, about how putting solar in the landscape influences animal behavior enough that they preferentially eat places and they preferentially shit places, and that redistributes the nutrients around the land in a particular way. And that has to be managed. So how you spread the solar panels and how you distribute them leads to changes in animal behavior that leads to changes in management on how you have to spread your resources back across the land if you wanted to, say, fertilize those pastures or do some other kind of pasture management to them. So it's an interesting insight, Jack.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're at 2:01. I can stay for a few if anyone wants to hang out a little bit longer. But folks who need to take off, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to Chad and Dave. That was really great. We've got this recorded. We will get it uploaded to the DLCD YouTube page and the project page for this. So folks who missed it can go back and watch. People who want to try and figure out Chad's crazy math equations can go and get a chalkboard out like Good Will Hunting if you're so inclined. But thank you, everyone, for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.